It will be an in-out referendum.
Again and again and again, it was kind of short-term tactics to try and keep the right-wing wolves from his door. But like all people who just are tactical, eventually tactics run out. And eventually you make the wrong decision.
I said, you are about to embark on something the like of which we will have never seen. Things will never be the same again, I said.
It is spreading and deepening the conflict within the Tory party.
We had disagreements, quite profound ones. I don't think there's a workplace in this country where friendships weren't put under strain by that referendum result.
David Cameron was one of a number of British prime ministers who had fed this idea that Brussels was to blame and that the public ultimately had to have a say. And we've all paid a price for it, in my view.
He said the will of the British people must be respected, but the country should have a new prime minister.
How comes he can scuttle off? He called all this on. So what's happened to that twat David Cameron?
Oh, no regrets.
Where is he? He's in Europe, in Nice, with his trotters up, yeah? Where is the geezer?
Everybody happy?
Yes, thank you.
Are we running?
Yep.
Right. Speed? Good.
I accept that sometimes people look at me and think that I look too happy and contented with life, even in adversity. And I've tried to have equilibrium and balance and receive bad news as in the same way I try and receive good news. But I'd hate the idea that people think I don't worry desperately about the decisions I had to take, the consequences that some of them had.
David had always said that he'd heard stories about Tony Blair and how he was received when he left politics and that there was a certain amount of hostility. David never really experienced that. Wherever he went, even if people disagreed with him, they were always courteous to him, he was courteous to them. What he would say, though, is that there is only one topic of conversation when he meets people now, and they do want to address him, talk to him about Brexit. And he says, you know, every morning, the last 3 years, I wake up and I ask myself, should I have called the referendum? And should I have resigned?
I do brood hugely. And the truth is, as Prime Minister, you don't have enough time sometimes to think. And when you stop being Prime Minister, believe me, you have plenty of time to think.
A petition signed by more than 100,000 members of the public and delivered to Downing Street, calling for a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU.
Oh, Britannia, Britannia all the ways. Returns never shall be slaves.
I completely understand that there are some people who will never forgive me for holding a referendum. But I think that the job of a Prime Minister is to see difficulties coming and try to resolve them and shape the country's response to them. And that is what I was trying to do with this vexed issue of Britain and Europe.
We need to wake up. We need to do what the British people want us to do.
It is for us backbenchers to say to Her Majesty's government, imitate the action of a tiger, for that is how you should behave towards our European partners, not like Bagpuss.
David Cameron and George Osborne constantly told me how much disregard they had for their own backbenchers and how much they were loathed by their backbenchers. There was no love lost there at all.
All three parties until recently promised the people a referendum on the EU. There's no point in clever wordplay.
Shame on you.
There was always a section of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that doubted if David was truly a Conservative or their sort of Conservative. They increasingly felt alienated by his style of leadership and some of the compromises that he had to make, and Europe became a touchstone issue for that.
Well, the Conservative Party has always been divided on the issue of Europe, right back from the moment Britain joined the EU. It was a problem that, like the Mississippi, just kept on rolling. And, you know, one of my biggest miscalculations was that I thought that most conservatives, like me, were sort of small e, small s Eurosceptics, that we wanted powers back from Brussels, we wanted change, we wanted reform, but we didn't want to leave. And I think what I totally underestimated was this sort of latent leaver gene in the Conservative Party.
Right now, we need to be energized, not paralyzed by gloom and fear.
David was aware of the huge damage Europe had done in the past to the Conservative Party and its leaders and could do again. And he could feel himself being pushed into a position on Europe which would have to be resolved.
The debt crisis affecting European countries is once again raising concerns about the stability of the Eurozone.
In Greece, they're protesting against the harsh new public spending cuts and tax increases being brought in as part of an EU bailout.
My hope was that Europe would not be the big and defining issue of my premiership. But pretty soon, the Eurozone crisis started to trigger all sorts of demands from Europe that you know, put Europe right up the agenda in the UK. To people who say you could have just sort of ignored these European issues or put them on the back burner, that was impossible. Immediately on becoming Prime Minister, we were being asked to contribute to Eurozone bailouts, completely unacceptable as the euro wasn't our currency. The Eurozone was saying we need a new treaty to make the Eurozone work better. And my view was, yes, of course, I can see that is necessary, but if you are having treaty change to sort out your issues, then it should be possible for us to have treaty change to sort out some of our issues. Sarkozy and Merkel say you can have some verbal reassurances, but you're not having treaty changes. And I knew at that moment that they were going to leave me with no choice but to veto the treaty. So I veto that treaty because we don't get the things that we want. And what happens? Well, you know, absolute amazement as they go ahead and do the treaty anyway.
David pensait qu'il pouvait bloquer le processus. C'était une erreur. Et je pense qu'il y a deux choses en Europe qui ne vont pas. Quand on s'isole et quand on essaye de passer en force. Voilà. Mais je pense que de l'autre côté, les Européens ont fait une erreur en ne donnant pas plus à la Grande-Bretagne.
I thought you couldn't have a situation where 1 minute you're told it's unanimity when it comes to new treaties, to 5 minutes later being told, well, actually, if we want to go ahead and have a treaty on our own, then that was somehow okay. And it was at that moment that I could see that our position inside the European Union was actually profoundly unstable.
It was not an easy thing to do, but it was the right thing to do. This week there will be meetings.
I remember after the treaty veto making a statement in the House of Commons, and for once the people who tended to be on the critical wing of the extreme Eurosceptics, the Bill Cashers and others, all saying this was splendid, that we'd had a veto, we'd told other European Union countries what we wouldn't put up with and all the rest of it.
And he was lauded by the right-wing newspapers. I think his ratings shot up in the opinion polls, and the backbenchers waved their order papers. There was a hurrah, hurrah. It was a great moment for David Cameron. I remember saying to him, I said, look, you know, you can give them as much red meat as you like, but they'll never be satisfied until we're out of the European Union and until you're probably out of a job.
Well, I went off for Christmas sort of reflecting on what had happened, and that got me thinking more and more that we did need to try and anchor and secure and sort out the instability of Britain's position inside the EU. And crucially, you know, I made the decision that it was time to move towards a referendum and a renegotiation. In January 2012,
we started a series of meetings about whether to offer an in-out referendum on Europe. And I was against, because I thought it would split the Conservative Party. I thought it was going to put business offside, done so much work to get them on side. And of course, fundamentally, we might lose the referendum.
George advised against holding a referendum, and he reminds me about that a lot even today. But during these discussions, he was actually one of the first to say, look, there are problems that we need to deal with, and also there are political problems.
I could tell, because I'd worked with David for so many years, that his mind was basically made up. That he'd gone into those meetings wanting to hear these arguments, but I knew him well enough to know that he had decided that he wanted to have that referendum.
And so you were aware just how dangerous the decision was that you were moving forward to taking?
Well, I thought the most dangerous thing was to do nothing, was to just say, this is all too difficult. Let's let this problem develop. Let's let the growth of public grievance rise. Let's let the splits inside my own party and indeed other parties grow over this. And let's not recognise that there are genuine problems here and genuine grievances. I thought that was a riskier path.
I wasn't convinced that offering a referendum at that point was the right idea. It was a way of almost shirking some of the responsibilities that any government needs to take in order to decide exactly what our relationship should be. The second concern that I had, frankly, was a personal one. I feared that if we did have a referendum, that I would end up on a different side from David. And thinking about what that might involve made me worried about what the consequences might be.
Of course I understand why David, until his dying day, will have to claim that he had some obligation, some unavoidable duty to hold a referendum. It's complete nonsense. To hold a referendum, basically to manage your internal problems within your own political party, and to then foist that dilemma onto the rest of the country because you can't manage your own party, that is not a good enough reason.
There was a meeting during my time as Chief Whip in Number 10, and I know that in the room were the Prime Minister, George Osborne, and me, where he talked about wanting to have a referendum. And it seemed to me that he was pursuing this for party management reasons, at least in part. And I think the hope was that having a referendum would lance the boil at least for a generation, and that people following the result would lay down their cudgels and accept it and go away. But that has not proved to be the case.
People will say you were, in a sense, thinking of party management above all else.
Well, of course, there was political pressure for a referendum. Because remember, we'd had the Maastricht Treaty, the Nice Treaty, the Amsterdam Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, and every time my party, and not just my party, other parties as well, have been on the side of having a public vote. But it wasn't just conservative Euroscepticism, it was British Euroscepticism, a sense that treaty after treaty, change after change, power after power passed from Westminster to Brussels, and the public being promised referendums but never delivered.
Speeches that are heavily hyped and endlessly trailed in advance often end up being a terrific anticlimax. But you couldn't say that of David Cameron's address this morning.
I probably spent more time on this speech than any other speech I'd made. And I knew that morning when I got out of bed, this was a huge decision.
We were on our way to David Cameron giving his speech, and he was going through all the reasons why we had to have a referendum. But I said to him, well, look, if you can think of all those reasons to have a referendum, is there a reason you can give for not having one? And he quickly said to me, because you could unleash demons of which ye know not.
I believe that I was trying to confront a problem that was, on the track in front of us. The next Conservative manifesto will ask for a mandate from the British people. But from the moment I made the speech, I knew there was a huge fight on my hands. And when we have negotiated that new settlement, we will give the British people a referendum to stay in the European Union on these new terms or to come out altogether. It will be an in-out referendum.
For us, the European Union...
Watching the Prime Minister, he's done enough to keep Tory Eurosceptics on his backbenches satisfied for the moment. But, you know, we've all forgotten a European election in 2014.
The UK Independence Party's emphatic victory in the European elections has sent a jolt through the other political parties.
The People's Army of UKIP have spoken tonight and delivered just about the most extraordinary result that has been seen in British politics for 100 years, and I'm proud to have led them to that.
Nigel Farage was an astute politician in that he saw an opportunity for, you know, appealing to people's worries and concerns and the rise of populism elsewhere. He was, you know, riding that horse in the UK. I always felt he was a bit like a sort of conservative who said, well, of course, Enoch Powell was right all along, and after a few pints, the conversation would probably get slightly unpleasant.
There we go. Very good. We have signed up through a series of treaties in Brussels to a total, unrestricted, open door. 485 million people have the right to come and live and settle in this country.
In the context of the European elections, people were sending a signal that their concerns were being ignored. And, of course, immigration was one of those, but some people characterise it as, oh, that's a race issue. It's not. It was much more about there are people who haven't made a contribution to our community who come here and are automatically entitled to housing or welfare or whatever it might be, free healthcare.
I think it's indeed true to say that between about 2011 and 2015, Britain actually created more jobs than the other 27 members of the EU combined. So we were in some respects a victim of our own success. But this didn't help with the fact that people looking at the immigration numbers were saying, hold on a second, we want this under better control. The number seems to be going up and up and up. Can the government please take more robust action to deal with it?
The Prime Minister wants to do more to control immigration. He'll cut net migration to the tens of thousands, a pledge which he made in opposition and repeated robustly in government.
No ifs, no buts. This is a promise we made to the British people, and it is a promise we are keeping. I think you have a far happier and more contented country if immigration isn't one of the number 1, 2, or 3 issues in politics. I wanted to get back to that, and that's where the desire for a target of bringing net migration down to the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands came from. But it proved to be far harder to achieve in practice.
The Conservative target of reducing net migration to the levels it had hoped for had been blown off course.
And of those coming in, it's estimated that 142,000 came from inside the EU.
Perhaps the targets that David committed to added to the sense that we weren't so in control because we kept missing them. We should have had a progressive argument about immigration both being a force for good and something that people felt they did want some control over.
The great difficulty of making these oversimplified promises to limit the numbers of immigrants is that by not implementing them, people say you're not doing what you promised to do, and that undermines confidence in government itself.
We counted them in and we counted them out. The ministers sacked or moved today in a reshuffle bigger and more wide-ranging than any had expected.
I made Michael Education Secretary in 2010, and we absolutely shared the same vision about what needed to happen. We wanted radical reform of education. But coming into 2014, I was beginning to worry that the reformer was actually becoming a barrier to the reform. Plus, I'd also had a conversation with him Sometime before, when he said to me, look, I want to go on doing my job forever, but if ever you want to move me, there's one thing I would like to do, and that is be your chief whip. And so I said, look, I would like you to move from education and do this vital job. We're not managing the party as well as we should. And I said, you had previously said you'd do this job. And he said, yes, if that's the job you want me to do, I'll do it.
I, after a day, thought, do you know what? I do worry that my going as Education Secretary would mean that some of the things that we need to do will remain unfinished business. And I worried that the wrong people would cheer, that Ed Miliband, that the most left-wing figures within the teaching unions, that the people who'd opposed us every step of the way would regard this as a scalp.
I remember being in the car, looking at my BlackBerry, suddenly an email pops up, and it's Michael Gove saying, I changed my mind. I don't want to do the job. I don't want to move. And I thought at that moment, look, if someone accepts a job and you want someone to do a job, you can't then turn around and unpick the whole thing. So I said, look, you know, you agreed to do this job. It's the right job for you. I've told you about the reshuffle. You know, please unsend that email. You know, that's an email we never discussed, and you're just going to get on with the job that I asked you to do and you agreed. And I stuck to my guns.
Mr. Speaker, we've always said that we will support the government when they do the right thing. So can I join thousands of parents across the country in congratulating him on getting rid of the Education Secretary?
David Cameron and Michael Gove had become very, very close as families. And as a result of that, the professional decisions were actually seen as very emotional in terms of their outcomes. Allowing the personal and the emotional to bleed through causes quite a few problems. So when it comes to the moment where a cold, rational, hard decision has to be taken, that leaves people feeling incredibly damaged.
In the short term, this looked like a very tough, strong move from a prime minister in charge of his cabinet, willing to demote friends. In the longer term, the consequences of the breakdown of that relationship between Cameron and Gove were enormous for David Cameron and even bigger for the future of the country. Quite simply, we might never have had that referendum vote to leave the European Union without Michael's demotion in 2014.
Hi there, how are you? Good to see you. Thanks.
High five?
This one, come on. Maybe not.
About halfway through our time in Downing Street, we had dinner. Nick Clegg, myself, Danny Alexander, and David Cameron. And I raised the idea, well, perhaps we could have a coupon election. In other words, run as a coalition with Liberal Democrat candidates where there already are Liberal Democrat MPs and Conservative MPs, and candidates where there are Conservatives now.
Nick Clegg lied to me! He said union would be free!
Nick Clegg and I had a conversation, albeit a brief one, about would there be an appetite for a coalition after an election, and I said yes. And at the time we had that conversation, he knew and I knew that it was a red line for me personally and for the Conservatives that we wouldn't form a government, I wouldn't be a Prime Minister in a government that didn't carry out that referendum. As I say, this is important because there is an accusation against me that, well, you only promised a referendum because you thought you'd never have to deliver it. That is absolutely not the case.
I said, I don't think you'll be able to enter into a coalition with us, even if you wanted to, because you've lost control of your right wing. And they said, oh, no, we'll deal with the Conservative Party. But I had come to the strong view that there was no way, under any circumstances, that I would lead the Liberal Democrats into a coalition with the Conservatives again, because I just felt the backbench, the tail was wagging the dog, but also because I just didn't want to be part of anything that would run the risk of us leaving the European Union. So I was very clear in my own mind. But what was so interesting was that clearly in those conversations I had with Osborne and Cameron, they thought they were still, oddly perhaps, more in control of their own party than they proved to be.
One of the most unpredictable elections in generations has come up with the most unexpected of results.
It was a tremendously exciting prospect. I felt I was free to say, right, this is a Conservative-only government, this is how we're going to do things. So it was going to be a one-nation government, but it was going to be driven by our priorities. You know, I was clearly putting the social justice, social opportunities agenda squarely out there. And we were more free to do things because while the Liberal Democrats were good coalition partners, in some areas they were a bloc.
Time and time again in coalition, I had to veto further cuts. I vetoed billions and billions and billions of pounds of welfare cuts, which the Conservatives then immediately imposed in the first budget after we were booted out of Whitehall. So, you know, I'm afraid the proof is in the eating of the pudding, is that we constantly restrained them. When they then had their chance to govern on their own, and boy, did they default to type, and some.
We've been clear that we want Britain to move from a low-wage, high-tax, high-welfare economy to a higher-wage, lower-tax, lower-welfare society. The benefit system should not support lifestyles and rents that are not available to the taxpayers who pay for that system.
What they're doing is taking it off the wrong people.
And the worst thing is that the poorer you are, the more you are going to lose.
It's definitely not a living wage. How he's got the front to call it that is offensive.
The view that we moved to the right after the 2015 election, particularly on the economy, I think is just nonsense. If you don't touch the welfare budget, it's far harder to do what we wanted to do and increase health spending and increase spending per pupil and all the rest of it in education. So I don't think it was the wrong thing to do. Change was needed.
In my view, the beginning of much of the present Euroscepticism was a consequence of austerity and the frozen living standards which created a yearning for change. The language of the Eurosceptics filled the vacuum. Foreigners, immigrants, bureaucrats, Brussels, all that sort of stuff.
Look, of course, some people and some communities felt economically left behind. The EU was part of the establishment that hadn't done enough to help them succeed in the globalized world. It was an important part of the backdrop to the vote, but I don't think it was the defining feature.
David Cameron is attempting something no EU leader has done before, asking every other country to agree a set of reforms that will then be put to a national vote on whether to remain in or leave the European Union.
I think I called it the asparagus and sea bass tour because there was one day when I think I had breakfast in Poland, lunch in France, dinner in Germany, and then a meeting back in Britain. And I think on every occasion, even breakfast, actually, there was asparagus and sea bass on offer. So it did become, we joked about that, but the whole tour was deadly serious because we were trying to get European countries to agree to things they had never agreed to before. I always knew it would be difficult, and look, I have many regrets about the process and what we did and what we got right and what we got wrong and all the rest of it. But I think in many ways, the biggest mistake, the biggest problem was expectations about what could be achieved through this renegotiation got too high.
Hundreds of migrants have begun arriving at Munich train station after crossing into Europe through Hungary. The EU says the crisis has put its reputation on the line.
The migration crisis was happening, and Europe's response to it, I thought, was absolutely hopeless. There was this perception that Europe didn't have a proper grip on migration and the movement of people. And this, I think, was a terrible background for the referendum. We were arguing to remain part of an organisation whose two principal activities, no borders and the euro, weren't going well. I think to voters, the immigration issue was the most important. I think this is the issue that I will, go to my grave wondering whether there was more we could have done. And what I wanted initially was to say, if the numbers are overwhelming, you can have an emergency brake and you can set a cap. We looked at this, and I came to the conclusion we were not going to get it from other European Union countries. I had that on very clear, direct conversations with European leaders, including Angela Merkel. It was not available. It never would have been available. I could see what we needed to get out of ever closer union, proper welfare restrictions on people coming to work in Britain, the pound and our position, the single market is safeguarded. I could see the power of these things, but I don't think they ever thought that Britain would vote to leave, and so it was hard to get the top end of what I was looking for.
Sorry we're not so early this morning. Can we just ask you, do you think now is the time to start the exit campaign? On Europe?
On Europe. Right.
George and I agreed how vital it was to try and secure the support of Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, because these were two people that, I wanted on my side of the argument, and I believed I had every chance of having on my side of the argument. I went to talk to Boris. I think we actually had a game of tennis, and we sat down after we'd played, and I said to him, look, you can't argue for leave. You've never argued for leave before. And, he would say, well, of course, if we leave, there's always another negotiation, there could be another referendum. And I said, that's just not the case, Boris. If you leave, you leave. That's it, you're out. Let's assume that Remain wins. I won't be Prime Minister forever. You'll have every opportunity in the future. And who knows, when the next treaty change comes and the whole thing is up for grabs, you could be the Prime Minister who would be helping to lead the argument for more changes for Britain. He was, I could tell, agonising over it. I don't think he really wanted to leave. Michael was more complicated because he was a lifelong Eurosceptic. And so George and I met with Michael in the flat in Downing Street.
I think it is the case that David hoped that I would support him, but I had been sceptical about our position in Europe for a very long time. In my heart, I was one of those people who felt that fundamentally it had been wrong for us to enter the European Union in the first place. I think David understandably felt that since I'd been prepared to knuckle under on a number of occasions beforehand and put my own feelings to one side in order to serve the team, that on this occasion, that I would do the same.
He then said, which was a bombshell to me because I didn't think he would go this way, he said, he was seriously thinking about supporting leave. He said his head was in a very strange place. He was finding it very hard to decide, and we pleaded with him.
I remember saying to Michael, look, if you go to the Leave campaign, you will destroy this government. If we lose this referendum, David Cameron will have to go. There's no way he'll be able to survive. And everything we've worked on will fall apart.
For heaven's sake, come down on the side of the argument with the people you've been working with and are working with.
I think that some of the conversations we had were attempts on his part to reassure himself that our friendship would mean that I wouldn't stray from the fold, as it were.
He said, well, if I do go in that direction, I will make one speech. I won't have anything to do with running the campaign. I will say what I think we should do, which is leave, and I will leave it at that. And I thought, well, at least that is something. It's one speech, it's one intervention. He's not running the campaign. But soon that turned out not to be the case.
David Cameron hopes a deal can be done in Brussels that he can use to persuade us to stay. But what will matter is what you make of it and the arguments that will follow.
The truth is about my thinking is that I became more worried about the way Europe worked and more frustrated and angry about some of the things it did, but I became even more certain that we needed to be in there, because if you're not in there, you're not making the rules. You're going to be a rule taker rather than a rule maker. I suppose it's sort of a bit like, you know, getting increasingly frustrated with your life partner, but knowing even more that you have to be in that relationship. That's what I felt. We had everything lined up. There was still a lot to be agreed, but I knew that if we really went at it and refused to leave until we got what we wanted, it could work.
The President of the European Council held a series of one-to-one meetings through the night to try and reach a resolution.
We were putting the finishing touches on the deal. I was completely exhausted, but in some ways, you know, excited that we were about to start. You know, we'd got a deal, things that people had said were impossible, and it did involve some compromises, but I thought it was a good piece of work for the country.
When we were at that renegotiation summit, quite late on, I got a phone call from Laura Kuenssberg, and she said to me that she wanted to know, did we know that Michael Gove was going to chair the Leave campaign and that he was going for out? And I remember taking this to David Cameron, and it was very clear to me that he felt very deflated by this and that this was actually a very severe blow.
I'll be making a statement after the Cabinet today, but thank you very much for asking. Thank you.
The Prime Minister said he was disappointed by your decision. What's this done for your relationship?
I felt that David, in his anxiety to do a deal, and I can completely understand why, had not perhaps held out for long enough, negotiated toughly enough, secured as much as he could.
There goes Michael Gove. Was that a difficult decision, Mr. Gove?
A cabinet meeting has been taking place today after a deal was finally reached in Brussels last night. The agreement included limiting some EU migrants' benefits and exempting Britain from further political integration.
The truth was, there was a lot of spinning of this incredible reform package, and when you stripped it apart, there wasn't an awful lot there they couldn't have got on a Sunday afternoon with an hour's conversation.
But I maintain that it was a good piece of work, that getting out of ever closer union, having restrictions on welfare, safeguarding the pound and Britain's financial services, these were good and useful things. In fact, I would argue they look even better now when you look at how difficult it's proving to get a good deal for leaving the European Union. You can now see how hard it is to negotiate with an organisation that holds up these things like the single market and like free movement of people as tablets of stone.
I sat and talked to him about the referendum, and I genuinely said to the Prime Minister, you are about to embark on something the like of which we will have never seen. Things will never be the same again, I said, because this is on a scale that, you know, and he said, well, you know, we've done the referendums in Scotland and everything else, etc. No, this is not like those. This is going to be enormous. I said, why are you holding the referendum now? Why don't you go back to Europe and say, you've given us nothing? And the Prime Minister answered me by saying, I don't want this to take over what I want to be my legacy, so I want to get it over and done with. And I could tell by that he thought that he was genuinely going to win.
The choice is in your hands, but my recommendation is clear. I believe that Britain will be safer, stronger, and better off in a reformed European Union. Thank you very much.
I was never overconfident. I knew it was going to be a very difficult campaign. So there was no complacency. But I think lots of things turned out much less good than I'd hoped.
Please join me in welcoming vote leaves.
Something else many of us thought we would never see. Half a dozen ministers from the cabinet permitted by the Prime Minister to go against the government's policy that we should stay in Europe.
Thank you very much.
An awkward snap of the Gang of Six This will be remembered.
When we were talking about how we were going to fire the gun that started the campaign, I became aware that David was distracted and he wasn't really paying any attention. And he took a very, very long time reading through and scrolling through his BlackBerry. And when he'd finished reading an email, he looked up and said, well, it looks like out. And he didn't need to tell any of us that he was referring to Boris. A few hours later, I got a phone call from him. He said, you haven't told anybody that Boris is for out? And I said, no. And he said, well, good, because I've had another text from him, and it's saying, well, I could be for Remain. And we were like, this is extraordinary. We're in a situation where a few hours ago he was saying he was out, and now he's hinting that he could be for Remain. We didn't hear anything for probably another 24 hours until a few minutes before he gave that extraordinary press conference the next day.
The text he sent me before he made his choice, in classic sort of Boris terms, was, leave will be crushed like a toad under the harrow, but I must be able to look myself in the mirror, or some such. It was that. And to me, that is all about, I'm making a choice thinking my side's going to lose, but that will benefit me in the long term. And I replied saying, it's not about you or me, it's about what is the right thing for the country, and you've never argued for leave, so why start now?
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. I thought I'd better come out and say something. You know you want to ask my views on Europe, don't you? Let me tell you where I've got to. I will be advocating vote leave, or whatever the team is called, because I want a better deal for the people of this country.
Boris,
look, you've had to go, Laura.
Quite close colleagues of yours do say that they see it as your pitch to be Tory leader.
No.
Reassure them that's not the case.
It's not.
I'm afraid I can't help but conclude that in the end, he thought that by fighting for leave, he was, taking the romantic, nationalist, conservative course. He had looked like a hero, and I don't think he expected for 1 minute they were going to win. So I think he felt he had every advantage by taking that position. So in the end, I think ultimately he put what was good for his political career ahead of what he actually thought was right for the country.
Thank you very much.
Anyone would think he likes the attention. Love him or loathe him, you can't ignore him. Boris Johnson has just taken a huge political jump that could change this campaign.
One of the problems we had during the referendum campaign is that we got sucked into a conservative soap opera that the broadcasters and the newspapers loved.
Chris Grayling saying his own Prime Minister negotiated a duff deal with Brussels.
Minister Priti Patel's suggestion, Remain campaign leaders, who include the PM, are too privileged to understand how mass migration hits the poor.
It is spreading and deepening the conflict within the Tory party.
Mr. Duncan-Smith, can you tell us why you're going against the Prime Minister?
I was watching members of the cabinet saying things that impugned the integrity of the government or my integrity or what have you. And all the time I was thinking, is this the moment either to fire someone for what they've done or to fight back on a much more personal and directed basis? And I held back from doing that, not because some people would say, well, you only cared about keeping the government together afterwards. It wasn't that so much as I didn't think it would work. A voter in Sunderland or Newcastle or Middlesbrough would be thinking to themselves, well, this has nothing to do with me. This is about some Tory argument.
If you're Prime Minister and your party is divided and you need to bring it back together again at the end, you need to take a pace back. If you are a player, then the gloves come off.
This was my campaign, this was my referendum, my renegotiation. I can't escape from that. And yet, in the middle of it, I was fighting with one hand tied behind my back. If I had attacked more vigorously, I would have just added to the sense of Tory psychodrama. But obviously, when you lose a campaign and when you look back, you wonder whether there aren't more things you could have done. If you leave weapons unfired after you've lost a battle, you ask yourself, well, perhaps I should have fired those weapons. I don't know. I think I will think about this forever.
Once we were in this fight, I thought, we've got to try and win it. And I was for, frankly, taking a more aggressive approach in the campaign against the people who are attacking us, rather than just sitting there and taking it. The only thing that would keep people voting to remain, who might otherwise switch, was fear of the economic consequences.
The four horsemen of Her Majesty's government arriving at a high-tech research facility in Bristol.
Britain would be permanently poorer if we left the European Union. And the price would be paid by British families. Wages would be lower, prices would be higher.
Forget your biblical plagues of frogs, boils, and Polish plumbers. They're the least of your worries, because Project Fear now stalks the land.
And I'm not going to be put off by people calling it Project Fear. I am fearful.
This could cost families £4,300.
Both Cameron and Osborne embraced Project Fear. Osborne thought that every time he made a dire pronouncement, it would scare people, as opposed to alienate people. He didn't understand the difference.
The most likely bill for our public services, if we left the EU, is £36 billion a year.
I was campaigning my then constituency in southwest Sheffield, and I noticed that there was just so much more emotion behind the Brexit argument. And George Osborne's sort of back of the fag packet calculations about how much worse off each family was going to be didn't resonate with people. Of course, they didn't believe all these figures being bandied about by politicians.
It is a stitch-up. Indeed, it is the biggest stitch-up since the Bayeux Tapestry.
It felt like we were making very practical arguments about the economy, but the arguments the Leave campaign made, particularly about control and immigration, that was a very powerful message, and it connected very directly with people. And part of our problem was we just didn't have a good enough answer to that.
And we will take back control of our democracy.
Vote Leave and to take back control of our country.
Take back control of this country. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah!
There's an old saying that in politics, when reason and emotion collides, emotion invariably wins. You persuade through reason, but you motivate through emotion.
Of course, there was the bus, which was, at one and the same time, completely infuriating and inaccurate. But on the other hand, I suppose, in this sort of post-truth world, quite a clever campaign.
Imagine what will happen to public services when Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia and Turkey join the EU.
Levels of net migration into the UK show that the number is the second highest on record. Net migration went up to 333,000.
Okay, thanks very much.
Morning.
So it's 333. Okay. And the net migration 84.
How does that compare to last year?
It's up.
Right. So it's more or less double.
But it was supposed to get net migration down to tens of thousands.
I remember there was one afternoon where I got called by the Sunday Times to say, look, we've got a 5,000-word letter from Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, and the headline of it is that David Cameron is being accused of corroding public trust because of his position on immigration.
Boris and Michael attacked me very personally for the pledge to reduce migration down to get it under 100,000. This was a sort of low point for me because I could see that they weren't just making the argument about in or out of the EU, it was actually trying to trash the government and the government's record and my integrity at the same time as fighting the referendum campaign.
What I think is cynical and unacceptable is to say that you can fulfill that pledge when manifestly you can't because of the EU regime.
I can completely understand why the referendum campaign was a very, very difficult time for David, and I can completely understand why he would have disagreed with the case that Boris and I were making, and sometimes the way in which we made the case.
As the campaign went on, I felt more and more I was descending into a quicksand where I couldn't get onto the higher ground, to mix my metaphors. But I felt at the time this sort of sense of frustration that I thought we had a winning hand, but I couldn't seem to play it.
In the last few days before the campaign, David got very melancholy about the prospects. He started to see the polls narrowing, and he understood, I think, before most people that it wasn't going well. And he said, look, when he left London and he was out in the country, he could feel the mood changing. He could sense it on the doorstep. And he was very worried about it. He came here for dinner on the Friday before the vote, and you know, we're a Jewish family. He said, you know, you're going to light the candles tonight. And I said, yeah, we always light the candles on Friday. He goes, thank goodness for that. I need all the help I can get.
We were all together in one room in the study on the first floor of 10 Downing Street, the so-called Thatcher study, and we were there with the close aides of David Cameron. There was me, there were the Cameron children, and we started to watch the results like everyone else in the nation. We didn't have any special information, we were just watching the television.
Leave is consistently doing better than predicted in vast ways.
Another big win for Leave.
It's a wake-up call, I think, for the entire political class. It's clear that...
To be honest, David wasn't that hopeful at all. It wasn't looking good, but you always hope, don't you, that it's all just been wrong as it had been in the past.
Leave towards a narrow victory for Leave. Along Downing Street.
But as soon as the results started coming in, it was, you could just see his mind thinking, okay, this is not looking very good at all.
Cast in favour of Leave was...
It's extremely dramatic. There's something going on in the northeast.
It looks like a pretty resounding win for the Leave campaign. We did expect...
The children were there, Nancy and Elwyn, knowing how important this was. And then suddenly the results started to come in, and Nancy turned to me and said, Daddy, we're losing this, aren't we? And, you know, it was one of those moments when I realised that was the way it was going.
The more it became clear that the votes weren't coming in for us, the gloomier the room became. And at one point, David said, let's just go downstairs to my study. He said, we've lost. And we'd already decided collectively that he was going to resign.
I don't want people to think that either I was relaxed at going, I wasn't, that I was happy to go, I wasn't, that I was relieved to go, I wasn't. I was desperately sad at leaving the job that I loved after having won an election with such a full agenda, but I genuinely 100% thought that I couldn't go on being Prime Minister because I wouldn't have the credibility to deliver Brexit because of everything I'd done and said in the referendum campaign.
Watch and listen carefully. This is history in the making.
The British people have spoken, and the answer is, we're out.
I do think that the referendum was ultimately not about David Cameron, not about me. It was about a direction for the country. And I do believe that David could have and should have stayed in office in order to ensure that the steps that were required, initially certainly, to give effect to the referendum result were taken.
This will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people.
The next morning, David Cameron came downstairs and he said with like very black humour, well, that didn't work out, did it? And that was very typical, I think, of David Cameron. He wasn't being flippant about it. It was a sort of his way of acknowledging, look, you know, this is a total mess and we've not done it brilliantly.
I walked with him down the corridor. I thought to myself, I was here at the beginning. It's fitting that I'm here at the end. And I said to him, you know, I have so much respect for you. And I sort of had tears in my eyes. And he said, don't cry, that'll make me cry and that won't do anyone any good. And then the doors opened and he went out and resigned.
I love this country, and I feel honoured to have served it. And I will do everything I can in future to help this great country succeed. Thank you very much.
It was a pretty emotional atmosphere. David came straight back after making the speech and came into the office getting an enormous cheer from his team, and then thanked us all for incredible journey and for our support, and then walked into his office with Samantha and shut the door behind him.
I think people will look back on the Cameron government as progressive, modern, but I feel very sorry for what happened. And I feel responsible. I was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in that government. We held a referendum we should never have held. We then lost that referendum, and the consequences for the country are grave. And the only thing I can plea in my mitigation is that a huge number of people wanted that referendum, and I made a case against it, but it wasn't heard. And David Cameron was just one of a number of British prime ministers who had fed this idea that we were different from Europe, that Brussels was to blame, and that the public ultimately had to have a say. And we've all paid a price for it, in my view.
Well, I am sorry about some of the things that have happened, and I do feel regret for some of the decisions and choices that I made. But I don't regret the idea of having a referendum combined with a renegotiation to try and solve what I saw with the genuine difficulties, not just party political difficulties, but genuine difficulties that Britain faced in Europe. But a deep regret that, what I attempted didn't work.
Do you feel remorse as well?
Well, I feel regret about what happened, and there are things that that if you had your time again, you'd do differently. But of course, in the end, the country voted, and the country voted to leave. Now, you might not like that, and I might not like that, and many people watching this program may think that was the wrong choice. But we are a democracy. We decided to hold a referendum. We voted in an election for a party that wanted a referendum. We voted 9 out of 10 MPs for a referendum. We held a referendum. That's the choice that we made. And that is the future for Britain. And that is something that can be delivered, that should be delivered, and that can be made to work.
Great. Can we cut it there, please?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Happy with that? I believe the party needed to change, the party needed to modernise. I began to think, well, maybe I could do this.
We thought, this is going to change everything. This is going to completely change the politics of this country, and indeed the politics of the world.
Move to one side, please. I said, look, David, we built a stable and moderate government together. Don't screw it up.